Right, it's now 6:03 and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining this evening, our first of a series of ongoing community engagement meetings. My name is Tiffany Oliva. I am the American Rescue Plan Act Coordinator with the City of Winston-Salem, and I work in the Budget and Performance Management Department. So today, as you all know, our focus is the Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. We will be hosting another session tomorrow in Spanish at 6 p.m. Mañana ofrecemos esta misma sesión sobre los fondos de recuperación fiscal local de coronavirus, que abreviado es CLFRF, en español a las 6 de la tarde. Usted puede encontrar la información para unirse a la reunión en cityofws.org CLFRF. Next. A couple of housekeeping items before we dig into the information. I did want to note that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed. Please do not unmute yourselves until we finish the bulk of the presentation. When it is time for questions and comments, I will let you all know, and at that time, if you could use the chat to submit your questions or comments, or use the raise your hand feature. If you click on participants, you should be able to, next to your name, click raise your hand. If you do, or if you're invited to speak out loud, you will be able to unmute and you will have 2 minutes to speak. And in general, we ask that you practice good netiquette, good internet etiquette. Thank you. Next. We're going to be covering some preliminary information that we've already shared with City Council through a special workshop of the City Council in August. I do want to acknowledge we do have one City Council member on the line, Council Member John Larson. Thank you so much for being here. So the Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Funds are funded through the Federal American Rescue Plan Act, which has a total pool of $1.9 trillion in total funding. The city's allocation is $51.7 million. There are additional grant opportunities that are in the American Rescue Plan Act, and the city is being vigilant to keep an eye on those that are available and those that we qualify for to make sure that we access the full potential of funding available. It's important to note that the U.S. Department of the Treasury has issued guidance for how we can spend these funds in a document called the Interim Final Rule. The final rule is expected to be issued by the Department of the Treasury, hopefully by sometime this winter, but it does outline general eligible uses. And they've also provided us with frequently asked questions and other resource documents to help us in making funding decisions. But in general, at this point, it's important to note that the guidance is interim in nature, and we are awaiting that final guidance. The other aspect that's important to note is that even though there are items that the U.S. Treasury states in the interim final rule that we're eligible to spend money on, we do have to pay close attention to what we have state authority to spend money on. So we do have a little bit more restrictive state authority to make certain expenditures that are generally allowed by the interim final rule. Next. Overall, the federal objectives of the CLFRF are to respond to the public health emergency or its negative economic impacts, to respond to workers performing essential work during the pandemic, replace public sector lost revenue, and then to make necessary improvements in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. In general, you can see that these have some sort of relationship or nexus to COVID-19. Next. I'm going to go in, dig in a little bit into the eligible uses of funding in the interim final rule. Next. Responding to the public health emergency, in general, anything that has to do with COVID mitigation with COVID-19 is an eligible use. You can also provide small assistance to small businesses, nonprofits, and individuals or other impacted industries. It can be used for rehiring governmental staff. Next. Of importance to highlight is that the interim final rule uses the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's qualified census tract tool, which is a granular way of identifying those census tracts with a higher concentration of low-income residents. And we know that those residents were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And so in these qualified census tracts, the federal government has given us broader authority to spend the funds. So especially in areas of addressing health disparities, efforts to reduce gun violence, promoting housing, early childhood care and learning, investments in healthy community environments, and workforce development, and there are others. And you can see on that slide a map of the qualified census tracts. Next. I also mentioned that you can spend the funds on infrastructure and water, sewer, and stormwater. These do have to comply with some project categories with the Environmental Protection Agency, and then also broadband. The one thing I want to note on broadband is while the Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund interim final rule states that we can spend on broadband, there are some limitations at the state level that limit how we can do so as a local government. Next. So digging into the proposed city framework that we provided in August to our city council members. Next. We outlined federal objectives of the CLFRF and how we plan to use the funds. So we want to use transparency, and in using transparency, we're open. We want to be open and transparent with how we use the funds and include opportunities like this for public engagement and also the creation of public-facing dashboards. We're looking at restoration. We want to use the funds to provide assistance to city operations and then just generally the local economy affected by COVID-19, and transformation, being outcomes oriented, documenting progress and strategic priority areas, fiscal soundness. These funds are one-time in nature, and so we're really not seeking to create recurring obligations for these funds. And then equity, all programs and grant expenditures are going to undergo an equity review so that we can ensure that we're distributing resources equitably throughout the community. Next. As I mentioned with the equity point, we have created an equity worksheet, and we're using that equity worksheet to understand or decide on which programs we may propose as a city staff, and also in the development of criteria for eligibility for different programs, and then also thinking about, advertising and access to the program. So we have questions in there like, what are the program's objectives and how do they promote equitable outcomes? What are potential unintended consequences and how can we mitigate those? Next. As I mentioned, we're also looking for that strategic plan alignment for anything that we do fund. And so we're looking at this area between the blue, the green, and the red circle, where there's an alignment between what's eligible in the law, equity priorities, the city strategic plan, and you can see the tiers on your slide of our different strategic plan priorities. Next. So we will be using a phased approach with phase number 1 being on relief priorities, restoration and immediate needs. This will have to do with economic relief and response to the increased violent crime. Future phases will look at making more long-term outcomes-based change in strategic priority areas and continuing public engagement and planning. Next. So now I'm going to shift to what the city has obligated so far with the CLFRF funds. Next. So we have received $25.86 million in the first tranche of the Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. While we have been allocated $51.7 million by the federal government, they did plan to disperse that money in 2 different payments. And so we've already received the first, which was half of that $51.7 million. And the second will come sometime in March till the summer of 2022, so next year. So far, City Council has approved $1.35 million for the crime prevention plan. $100,000 for the right to counsel eviction diversion, which will be provided in partnership with the Legal Aid of North Carolina, Winston-Salem office. And then $1.5 million in premium payment to city essential workers. And so the bottom line here, you can see the total available, including additional funds to be distributed in 2022 that we have left to spend. Next. So digging a little bit deeper, community violence intervention programs, I mentioned that we have obligated $1.35 million for this purpose. So we'll be partnering with community groups and also working in-house to reduce violent crime and create opportunities for at-risk youth. And so you can see the list of program areas that we will be funding through the $1.35 million, from SOAR to Cure Violence to a gun buyback program, pre-K initiatives, recreation programming, and conflict resolution. Next. We've also funded the right to counsel eviction diversion program. We know that there have been concerns with the recent end of the eviction moratorium that there will be an increased caseload of evictions. And there's a concern that renters are unable to access funds or have the knowledge to navigate the eviction court system. And so the city is partnering with Legal Aid of North Carolina to help fund the cost of a second attorney to assist renters in navigating that eviction court system. Next. And then the final that we've obligated so far is city employee premium pay. We're going to be looking retroactively to the work offered or provided by our essential and eligible workers in the city from June 2020 to June 2021. And we'll look at the level of work that they provided on office and in office interacting with others. And it will be a $500 one-time lump sum payment. Next. So other restorative and transformative priorities that we're looking at. Next. So we presented a draft phase framework to the City Council in August. This has been adjusted slightly to include some of the already approved programs and other possible programs for consideration. You'll see in phase one, which is what we're focusing on here today, we've already spent the community violence interventions or the community violence prevention plan, evictions diversion, and then working on issuing those premium payments. But something else that we're looking at is recovery grants for small businesses, social service nonprofits, and travel, tourism, and arts nonprofits. And so that will be a total pool of $3 million if approved by the City Council. City staff should be presenting to City Council here in the next month a full package of eligibility criteria and what a scope of what that program would look like. As scoped and as shared with the City Council, that program will provide assistance to businesses that are in arrears. So they're behind on mortgage, rent, lease, utility payments to help keep them afloat. Next. And here is kind of digging a little deeper into that potential scope of the recovery grants programs and some of the eligibility criteria. So of course, being located within city corporate limits. For businesses and nonprofits, we're looking at those organizations to have been fully functioning on or before January 1st, 2020. Businesses have to be independently owned. They may have no more than 25 full-time employees or the equivalent of that. And then that category of having missed payments. And then the same for social services and travel, tourism, hospitality, and arts nonprofits. They have to have missed payments, have a lower organizational budget, $1 million, not including pass-through funding, and board approval required for the application. Again, this is a proposal for what we're going to include as eligibility criteria. It is still pending City Council approval. And once we have that information, we'll be sure to share it with you in the appropriate monthly briefing. Next. And here I just wanted to share with you the strategic plan alignment of what we've proposed and scoped. You'll notice that the primary alignment has to do with economic vitality and diversity. Next. So public engagement and next steps. Next. So we did have public engagement, a meeting on April 28th, where we had 33 speakers who shared with us their thoughts about how we should spend the coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds. And we also asked the public to give their feedback through an online form, which we received 160 responses on, as well as scraping social media posts and pulling those comments. And then we had 160 comments on those posts. And in that word cloud, you can see some of the items that were most frequently mentioned across each the public input meeting, online public forum, and social media scraping. Next. So we're here today for our first monthly virtual community meeting. These are going to be available in English and Spanish on a monthly basis from today and until further notice. We are looking here in November to issue that premium payment to city employees that the city council approved. And then sometime this fall to propose to city council that recovery grants program as scoped, as well as presenting a transformational scoring matrix for city council consideration. This transformational scoring matrix has to do with the next phase of funding and trying to get ourselves in the mindset for how we will spend more of that outcomes-based and strategically aligned funding. In December and January, if approved by City Council, we hope to open the Recovery Grants Program. And then in spring 2022, hope to begin the transformational obligations and expenditures and open a request for proposals process for certain programs in that transformational phase. Next. Information about how we're spending these funds, all PowerPoint slides that we've shared with the City Council, and meeting recordings are available at cityofws.org/CLFRF. And you can keep up to date there on all of that information, but also when we'll be hosting the monthly meetings. We do hope to share with you all a schedule soon so that you can go ahead and mark your calendars. And again, I'm Tiffany Oliva. I am the American Rescue Plan Act Coordinator with the City of Winston-Salem. Next. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead for the folks who've joined us here today, take some time to answer questions or comments. Again, if you could raise your hand or use the chat function to ask your questions or to make your comment. If you are calling in today, please relieve yourself on mute, and I'll leave some time here at the end to allow those that are calling in to unmute and ask their question or make their comments. Again, please note that we are being recorded and live streamed right now. Please raise your hand or use the chat function. And if you do, or if you are invited to unmute, you will have 2 minutes to ask your question or to share your comments. Thank you. Jamie, you can stop sharing now. Okay. So if you could put questions in the chat, raise your hand, and we'll be happy to get any questions answered for you or to hear your comments. I see Jocelyn has raised their hand.
Hi, how are you? Good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity. My concern is regarding areas that are in the qualified census tracts that do not have access to natural gas as a utility. For some reason, several of these areas were left out during urban renewal. For others, it may have just not been recognized as a need in those communities. I think there are environmental and economic impacts for this. For environmentally, it will reduce the carbon footprint for some of these communities. And as regards to economics, it will give an opportunity to reduce the poverty level because it will give additional income for a better heating system for those residents. I do believe it has sustainability, transformative, and a poverty reduction opportunity for areas that have not received support for decades of time. Thanks.
Thank you for that comment, Jocelyn. We've written that down. Other questions or comments? Okay, Regina Hall.
Thank you, Tiffany. I just wanted to say that I appreciate how you were able to present the information tonight. It was a lot of information, but I appreciate the way that everything was laid out. It was extremely helpful. So don't have a question, at least not right now, but I did want to say thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Larson.
Yes, thank you very much, Tiffany, for that presentation. It was rapid fire and a lot of information conveyed. I'm hoping people will be able to go onto the website and pick up the information that's in the slides. Two takeaways, and one question and a takeaway. It would appear that the actual distribution of funds to small businesses and nonprofits, the actual availability of that money will not occur until after the new year. Is that correct at this point?
I would say that's correct at this point. Scott, it looks like you came on camera for a second. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, Councilmember Larson, thank you for the question and for the community as well. I think we want to get those funds out as quickly as we can, but we do want the mayor and city council to approve those guidelines. And as soon as that happens, we will be working feverishly to have that application available. So the hope would be as quickly as possible, but yes, it will most likely be well late into this calendar year or potentially early the next one.
Early next year. Second observation, I don't see any money being allocated to public works as far as water, sewer improvements within the city structure. Is that money not eligible for these purposes? And I know that we have a lot of expenditure currently in our public works department. Where does that fall within the discussions?
Councilmember Larson, another great question. Currently, it is not included as a line item in the proposed framework. That doesn't mean that we don't have the possibility to consider it. It is an eligible use of the coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds. You may have noticed in that framework, we do have a set aside for city lost revenues. If for some reason we aren't able to claim those, and we know that we might not be able to based on how the federal government is making us calculate lost revenue, we could consider one of those investments, but that would be a conversation with the city manager's office and you all as the city council.
So the unpaid utility bills that are currently out there, they're not eligible for reimbursement?
Councilmember Larson, that is a very interesting question, and we'll have to go back and look at it. The water and sewer component referenced directly in the interim final rule is related to infrastructure, and so would not be eligible there. However, under some of the economic hardship components, it may be. That's something we will go back and look at and get a response for you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining, Councilmember Larson. And I do want to acknowledge that I did see Councilmember Barbara Burke join the meeting as well. Thank you for being here. Okay, I did receive a question in the chat. Will there be any opportunities for nonprofits in future phases who have budgets over $1 million? The answer to that is yes, if approved by City Council. The way that we have scoped it does do so. Our hope is to have an outcomes-based approach where we can issue a request for proposals process where nonprofits who are focused on strategic priority areas can be considered in the areas of social and economic assistance. So in short, yes, as currently scoped, as long as it is approved by City Council.
Tiffany, I got another comment in the chat. Would just like to kind of read it out loud here and then address it related to housing affordability and the lack of available units. That rents are very high. So I think what I would direct back here, it's a very long comment as I read through it. There is a significant amount of money in the framework that we have put forward to the mayor and city council to address affordable housing and the construction of new units in that area. So I believe if we were to go back to that, you'd see what was shown as a $20 million set aside. Again, mayor and city council would have to approve anything in those areas, but staff had, based on strategic plan alignment, flagged or set aside as a potential priority the construction and redevelopment of housing units, particularly for affordable housing for those under the 80% AMI threshold. So like I said, there's a pretty long comment along with that. Rents are too high and things of that nature. I'll be more than happy if that person would like to also comment openly as well, but just wanted to address that.
Thank you, Scott. And I did receive another question that says, can you define PAF? I missed that. What this person is referencing is in the proposed framework. We have scoped the ability to also provide some assistance with COVID mitigation. PAF stands for properties and facilities. For those of, I did see folks just join during this kind of question and answer time. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand and we will call on you to speak or ask your question, or you can enter it into the chat. Okay, I see another question in the chat to me. Has behavioral health care been eliminated as a funding consideration under the public health care crisis? Scott, can I turn that question to you?
That's absolutely, Tiffany. So in the greater scheme of behavioral health care, there is one thing currently that the city is already looking at in terms of response models. The Public Safety Committee of the City Council has had updates of a project that we're working on in terms of how law enforcement responds to mental and behavioral health calls, and the city is potentially looking at the eligibility of ARPA funding to assist with a co-response type model under which both a law enforcement officer and a clinician would be made available for law enforcement calls for service. Additionally, beyond that, as we get into the more transformative approach, and kind of second phase, the opportunity for outcome-based intervention models will be open for application for things of that nature, but it will be imperative to define the outcomes associated with those. So again, that is something, if you were to look at the timeline, you would see hopefully applications coming on earlier in the calendar year 2022 for that purpose. There is not an explicit carve out in the framework, but there are what you'll see as generally called social assistance programs and things of that nature at a high level. And so I think it would be appropriate for those types of programs to be part of an application process if the council, mayor and council deemed it so.
I do want to add to that comment as well that it's important to note that the county has also received an allocation of the federal coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds. And so that's also another great question for the county. Councilmember Larson?
Yes, thank you again. Maybe this is for Scott or maybe for you, Tiffany. You made mention earlier in the program about other programs that might be funding. Do you have any idea of what those programs, what categories of activities they might include? And are we monitoring the Build Back Better program in Congress as to how that might overlap things that we might be doing, particularly in capital improvement areas that would duplicate or replicate what we're looking at as far as these fundings go?
Yes, sir, absolutely. So to the first part of your question about the transformational programs, we're still working on defining what that process will look like, but it's focused on areas of social and economic assistance. It could include outdoor environments. We did have some digital divide funding included in there. And as you know, there are other federal dollars that are flowing down in the area of digital equity and in closing that digital divide. So we are keeping an eye on all of those other federal funding opportunities. I imagine digital divide will be one that we'll wait to see what flows out before we start spending those dollars. As far as the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, we do have a local organization that is applying for those funds. And so we are looking to see how we can be involved with that. Scott, do you want to add something?
So I would just add generally to that there is a lot of funding coming from multiple streams at this point. So not even just the American Rescue Plan Act, there's leftover CARES Act money that's still being made available, as well as general appropriations that were made at the federal government through a Consolidated Appropriations Act in late December of last year. So I think that we're going to continue to see opportunities. We'll be working with the county as well, Councilmember Larson, to ensure that we're not funding the same things that the county is in terms of duplication of efforts. But there is a lot of potential infrastructure money coming down the pipeline, and it's just going to be incumbent upon staff to stay abreast of everything that's happening at the federal and the state level, even in the state budget. And so I think right now we've cast kind of a wide net, but at some point, yes, if money's become available through another source, if you look at the original framework, you'll see that set aside potentially for the digital divide, which is one of your strategic priorities. If additional funding becomes available either through the federal or state governments for digital divide, it may be an opportunity to use that money for other priorities as well. So we're going to have to stay on top of everything that's coming down the pipeline.
How quickly, if I could ask realistically, could we expect to see implementation of universal Wi-Fi in this city based on the digital divide movement that we've got? We're talking about a lot of money being allocated to it recently. And then we sort of experienced it with this homeschooling thing last year about the need to get our programs up to steam. Do we have any idea as to what our target is to try to implement some of these programs that we're funding currently?
So my primary response to that is going to be that the Forsyth County Digital Equity Commission has issued a final report on that. And I believe something will be coming to the mayor and city council to discuss what their recommendations are in those veins. As far as ARPA money is concerned with this and city money generally, there are a lot of state restrictions on what we can do infrastructure-wise in terms of providing Wi-Fi. So we can build that infrastructure for ourselves to use, but right now don't have the state authority to essentially build that out and then allow a private entity to lease it or to use it for private purposes. So Councilmember Larson, I think you'll get an update from the Forsyth County Digital Equity Commission as well as some language from the city attorney on what we can do and would potentially look to the city manager for any other comments on that. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
I did receive a question in the chat that says, with so many nonprofits receiving PPP loans, do we have a sense how many local organizations would be eligible based on the minimum criteria? So PPP loans, we are including that in the recovery grants program as scoped, and in the development of the application, we do want to have a sense of what small businesses and nonprofits have received in other federal funding sources. I don't think that we have a full sense yet of how many local organizations would be eligible based on the minimum criteria, but what we are trying to do is make sure that we are not creating too many barriers to entry for this program, and that our small businesses and nonprofits in most need can access those recovery dollars if approved by City Council.
So Tiffany, I've got a couple more here in the chat that I'll bring up. See here, when an application or RFP is released, will individual nonprofit representatives be able to meet with Tiffany and or other staff members to understand if or where we are eligible to apply? The general answer to that is that yes, we are going to make ourselves available to anyone who wants to ask a question about eligibility or the application itself, as we do with the regular community agencies process, where we provide technical assistance for those having questions. We would be more than willing to, if you have questions, to try and answer those on the front end. Additional questions here about, again, I think affordable housing and could the city purchase properties and rent those essentially? As I think that's what this is getting at. I do believe the mayor and city council are going to see in the coming months a plan related to affordable housing and perhaps affordable and workforce housing that will address our strategic priorities and the strategy for moving forward there. Not fully sure that the city would have the ability to just purchase properties and then act as the lessee. There may be some ability to do that or work around, but I do believe the mayor and city council will be getting a report from the community development department talking about how we might use these ARPA funds and more generally how our housing policies would be structured going forward around affordable housing. Let's see here, Tiffany, I've got another one. Can the process extend to other city staff members who encounter residents on a daily basis? Fire, sanitation, utilities are examples. I believe that's from Joycelyn, maybe Ms. Johnson. If you'd like to expand on that question.
It was as you talked about behavioral health personnel going out along with law enforcement. I think there are other departments that encounter residents that might need the same support. And those examples, fire, sanitation, utilities were some of the examples.
Thank you for that question. I would say as we continue to look at that, we have seen, and the county is an example of this in their mobile integrated health unit that they're using with their emergency EMS responses. And I do believe the city of Raleigh has actually started to do this with fire. Some of those others in sanitation utilities, those are very interesting questions. So thank you for the question and the comment, and that will give us some food for thought as we continue to think about the needs for those services in our community.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions or comments, please raise your hand or enter them in the chat.
So, Tiffany, I'm going to keep reading here as the comments come in. I'm going to summarize this comment essentially as this is a large pot of funding, and are we attempting to really make some investments in a few key areas? And the response to that would be generally yes. In the transformational phase of this, we've are using that term transformational very intentionally. Would like to see the needle move in a couple of areas, specifically related to the city council strategic plan. So whether that be affordable housing specifically, and initiatives to remove barriers to economic mobility, I do think that we want to see movement on a couple of key performance metrics in those areas. So that would be the intent, and I think more generally, that's what a lot of communities across the nation are struggling with as these monies have been received. What are the most important and most strategic areas that this money can be used to create the greatest value in the community, and also aligning with the IFR, using that equity lens to ensure that the monies are being spent and used in areas that were hardest hit by COVID-19 as well. Tiffany, I think that's everything I've got in the comments here on my end.
I have one more related to property and facilities management, and the funding in the framework. Is the PAF money just for city properties and facilities? Yes, that has to do with COVID mitigation. Okay, well, Scott, yes?
I would also comment that that money was just a potential set aside, right, and has not been officially allocated or appropriated by the mayor and city council. In line with the IFR, if we had specific COVID mitigation strategies that we needed to implement at public assembly facilities, we were simply noting that the eligibility existed to do so.
Thank you. All right. Last call for any comments or questions in the chat. If you are calling in from your phone, now would be the time to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment. Otherwise, we will be calling this meeting to a close. So I'll give everyone just another minute. All right, seeing none. Scott, you unmuted.
Tiffany, the last thing I will say there is, again, these are intended to be recurring, ongoing conversations so the city can work to keep everyone in the community aware of where we are, what the city council has approved, and to take feedback and input as well as answer any questions that we have. So while we appreciate your time today, this is not our one and done. We will continue to have these community conversations for as long as we have the ARPA funding. That's our commitment currently as part of the transparency that the city is committed to with the local coronavirus local fiscal recovery fund.
Thank you, Scott. And just a reminder to everyone on the virtual meeting today, or watching the recording or the live stream of it, you can access any information about the Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund at cityofws.org/CLFRF. That website will also have a form posted to it after this meeting or tomorrow, where you'll be able to ask questions, and that will be sent directly to us, or you can make comments through that as well. We will also include information about the future meeting schedule on that website. And in general, that's where you can access any information about Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Again, that's cityofws.org/CLFRF. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.